Hello, and welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Phil Wasielewski, and I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. Joining me today will be Dr. Frank Hoffman to discuss his seminal work on hybrid warfare, what it means, what it does not mean, and why it is important to understanding current international relations. We will also be discussing my reservations about this term regarding the uses and abuses of the term hybrid warfare. For those who are interested in the study of irregular warfare and political warfare, the name Frank Hoffman is certainly one that is familiar to you. Dr. Hoffman is a retired lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve and served for 8 years on active duty as an infantry officer in the 2nd and 3rd Marine Divisions, as well as a company commander at the Marine Corps School of Infantry. From 1986 to 2001, he served in the Marine Corps Reserve, where his last position was with the Commandant of the Marine Corps Strategic Initiatives Group. Besides his Marine Corps service, Dr. Hoffman has served for 4 decades as a national security scholar and a defense practitioner, including 2 senior political appointments at the Department of Navy and the Department of Defense, and service on 2 congressional commissions. In 2017, Dr. Hoffman was a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense and worked on writing the National Defense Strategy. He recently retired from years of service at the National Defense University. He's the author of 3 books: Decisive Force, a critique of the Powell Doctrine; Mars Adapting, on military adaptation from the Second Industrial Revolution of steam and steel; and Mars Unbound, which will be coming out soon. Dr. Hoffman has also written numerous articles, too many lists here, and is a visiting fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and also serves on the board of advisors of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Now, just speaking for myself, however, I find the most impressive part of Frank Hoffman's biography is that he's a fellow alumnus of the University of Pennsylvania and also a former fellow member of the Penn Lightweight Crew Team. Frank, welcome to Overheard.
Hey, great to be here, Phil.
Well, let's dive right into today's discussion. In 2007, the Potomac Institute published a paper by you titled Conflict in the 21st Century, The Rise of Hybrid Wars. In this paper, you noted that the National Defense Strategy of 2005 described a number of traditional, irregular, terrorist, and disruptive threats or challengers to the United States. This, you wrote, created unique planning dilemmas for strategists who had to prepare for threats from states with conventional capabilities, as well as more likely asymmetric threats from non-state actors. You suggested that future contingencies would more likely be a unique combination of hybrid threats specifically designed to target U.S. vulnerabilities, and you also wrote that in the future, we can expect to face competitors. It's interesting you did not use the word enemies, to employ all forms of war and tactics simultaneously. This article was very influential in popularizing the term hybrid warfare, although it did not invent it. So, Frank, please tell our audience how you came to write this article. What are the antecedents of the concept that is described in it that is now called hybrid warfare?
Well, we're going to go a little bit further back. The tasking came from General Hanlon, who was the commanding general at Quantico in late 04, almost the beginning of 05. And he gave me this task to develop a new threat concept for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps frequently uses a strategic environment and or a threat concept to help drive its combat development efforts. And I had just come off the Commission on National Security, where I had spent 2 years doing the future forecast for that U.S. commission. And we focused a lot in that commission on Homeland Security, and I had worked on the development of the Department of Homeland Security both in 1999 and 2001, and helped write the legislation for that. So they knew I had an interest in futures and talking about future warfare. So I got this task, and the guidance was somewhat unique. I was told it was insisting that I translate foreign literature, look at foreign concepts, and that I didn't have to write a concept that would justify the Marine Corps' amphibious predispositions in its past. I was given a little bit of latitude in that sense that I wasn't supposed to sell our programs for once. And I was also then given also the guidance to find this foreign literature. And that literature led me into reading things like the Chinese Unrestricted Warfare, which talked about cocktail warfare. It led me to I got some amphibious translations for me that I tasked out. And I found this wonderful article by Mahmoud Gharib, who I think you're familiar with, who talked about multivariant warfare. And then I found this Iranian doctrine on Mosaic doctrine, which talked about combinations of forces. And what seemed to be the common thread for me, writing for an institution that doesn't have a specific regional focus, but sees itself as a global expeditionary force that has to face a variety of threats and contexts, that the dominant theme of combinations warfare, some kind of blurring and blending of modes of warfare seemed to be the most interesting thing. So I'm still working on that concept, and General Mattis rings me up and ask me to come up to his office. And this would be, June, July of 2005, and he's relatively new. And he said he had to give a big speech, and he wanted to make a point into the literature in Washington, D.C., in this big speech in Washington, D.C., and he wanted to know what I was working on. And so I briefed him on this concept with a couple of slides. Well, I think I called it multidimensional warfare. And I wish I'd used multimodal because I like that term better, and it's certainly better than hybrid. But as I was briefing it, the general didn't like the length of the term multidimensional. He didn't like the hyphens and too many syllables. And he said, "What's wrong with hybrid?" This was up in his office, and I use this talk, in my speeches. He always denies it, but he's the one who instituted the word hybrid. And I ended up liking it. And I liked it even more when I tested it in a couple of audiences out in Israel and places after Hezbollah's attack in 2006, because of its biological orientation and some of the things that it brings about. Think about what really is hybrid about hybrid warfare. So that was the context. He gave the big speech that turned into an article. The proceedings, which sponsored the speech, got the article. They ran that in November of 2005, and they ran about half of the speech, which had the word rise of hybrid, which General Mattis didn't like because it implies something unique and new about it. And he and I thought that there was examples of this in the past. It wasn't historically unprecedented to us, but I like the word the rise of, perhaps too much, and use that in the title of both my monograph and the article, even though the general wasn't particularly, in love with it. And there's a lot of context behind this. The strategic context, it's a unipolar moment. There are no dragons out there. There's only snakes. We have this immense amount of power in the world. We're uncontested. There are no superpowers to contest us. And there's a lot of consternation in the literature. There's the fourth generation warfare group, which is very popular with the Marine Corps, which is very good at critiquing industrial age warfare, the third generation, but kind of weak in my mind in articulating what the fourth generation was, other than asymmetric. You had Mary Caldor talking about new wars. You had General Rupert Smith talking about wars amongst the people, which seemed to be very much 1990s, European, Kosovo, Serbia, and maybe some other counterinsurgency theories. It just didn't seem to me capture the future, which I anticipated being the diffusion, again, coming out of my work with the Hart-Rodman Commission, seeing the diffusion of technology to non-state actors, and also a lack of states that would be willing to contest this directly. They would use sponsored forces or proxy forces. That I saw that as a context. And the final aspect of the context is Mr. Rumsfeld's pushing for transformation, pushing for the Marine Corps to donate 30,000 troops to Special Operations Command, or to become the Special Operations Force in of itself. He saw war breaking up into specialties away from conventionality. And General Mattis and I saw a convergence in the middle of the conflict spectrum between these modes. And that's where we put our stake as a focal point for where future warfare would have the most consequence and the higher likelihood of occurring than, say, lower forms of counterinsurgency or higher forms of conventionality. And that kind of became a focal point. The Army bought into that. The British Army bought into that. General Dempsey, General Conway, General Mattis. A lot of senior officers bought into that. Mr. Gates bought into that and cited me in a speech, which was published in Joint Force Quarterly. He bought into this messy middle, as did Dave Johnson at Rand and a lot of the British folks at that time. Again, that's, we live in a whole totally different strategic context right now than we did 20 years ago. So I'm not in love with the concept. I'm amazed that we still have the vocabulary kind of hanging out there. But I think we did get some things about the future, better than most for threat concepts, from a service at that time.
Well, that brings an interesting point. Now, almost 20 years later from the publication of that article, you were just at the U.S. Army War College to talk about the continuum of conflict. How does your earlier work on hybrid warfare fit into your present scholarly work on war?
Yeah, well, I've walked away from the notion of a continuum with unconventional or coercive subversion on one end and irregular warfare and hybrid in the middle and conventional warfare. I've gotten away from this spectrum or continuum concept, and I've focused now on four types of operations that I think are a menu or a buffet for future threats, to consider. And those four modes are conventional warfare, proxy warfare, societal warfare, and cognitive warfare. And I show these in my presentations now as a four-circle, Venn diagram with overlap and connecting between these things, and talk about you can use the war in Ukraine as an example, because there's clearly conventional capabilities. There's clearly proxy forces. The societal warfare is the attacks on the critical infrastructure, whether directly or by sabotage or by missiles. And cognitive warfare is the information battle, the narratives, both covert and overt, to change the will of the people or to change, decision making. And I see this is a more representative of how I see the future. And I see different cultures, whether it's China, Russia, mixing that up. But I see in their practice all four of these aspects. And I just don't have a continuum anymore. It's just this four forms of operations for 21st century warfare. I call it the four phases of future warfare.
I see. Now, we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where you mentioned to me that the hybrid warfare concept changed with Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in early 2013. Could you explain to our listeners what you meant by that?
Well, I think in Europe, the Crimea operations somehow becomes an awakening in a sense that there's something going on they're not prepared for, because they certainly weren't considering great powers changing borders in Europe in the 21st century. It was a big shock to Europeans who had been brought up to think that, war was something to be studied historically for history's sake, but not for its relevance to contemporary security threats. So all of a sudden, the word hybrid got yanked into the Crimea operation in a sense as a blend of semi-proxy, unconventionality, surprise, information warfare, and military capability all kind of blended in. So it seemed to pick it up. But at that point, a lot of Europeans, particularly at the NATO headquarters, thought that the most likely and the most consequential threat was far to the left in the conflict spectrum. And they used hybrid warfare to describe an admixture of sabotage, coercion, subversion, political warfare, and maybe some, election interference. They saw the hybridity being this blend of all these little sub-activities that in my writings are more commonly formed under coercive or illegal forms of statecraft, certainly below the W word. So the European use of the term hybrid warfare, I don't see the hybridity. I don't see the cross generation, and I don't see the W. I don't see it as a form of warfare. So, when I hear a European talking about hybrid warfare, it's like a European talking about football. He's talking about something that's a little white ball that's kicked around with your feet. And when I hear an American or American general who's familiar with my writings use the term, like General Madison, I would use it. It would be an American football player with a helmet on with a brown leather ball in his arm. We're using the same word, football, to mean, and hybridity mean two different things to me. And so I try to alert audiences to be able to make that distinction. I don't like the European version. I don't see the hybridity. I don't see the warfare word. I think it's distracted a lot of attention away from things we already knew that we didn't need a label for, like political warfare subversion that already existed. And I think for NATO, it distracted attention from a larger range of threats. I remember going out to see Mrs. Von der Leyen had me come out to Berlin to talk about their white paper before they published it. And she asked me, should hybrid warfare be the leitmotif, that was her word, of the German future, thoughts on warfare? And I said, no, not as long as a potentially dangerous threat like Russia is in the neighborhood. They can't afford just to think about the low end. And I encourage her to think more about conventionality and hard power to deal with Russia, even though there's clearly a tradition of Russian activity in active measures, but that should not be the leitmotif of their Defense Department, because many of the things that are considered under their version of hybrid warfare really deal with social resilience. It has nothing to do with NATO's mission, deals with things that either law enforcement, the intelligence community, or the diplomatic community has to engage. So as soon as you label it the W word, I think it over-militarizes the term. And I think NATO's been dragged off into the wrong place. And I think they use less of that term now, although I see it in the newspaper quite frequently. But I think the leadership in NATO knows where to put that.
Well, that raises my next question. If you go to a dictionary, at least an English dictionary, and you look up hybrid, you'll get a definition that's something like this: hybrid, something combining two different elements. Very simple. Now, as you and I have discussed before, I do not like the term hybrid warfare for a number of reasons. You've already alluded to one. Let me take a few minutes for our listeners to discuss why, and I'd like to get your input and also your pushback, if necessary, to this. First, I believe, through no fault of your own, the term hybrid warfare has been stretched to mean just about anything to anyone, and today finding one true definition to encompass all the different interpretations of what is hybrid warfare is likely impossible. There's just too many conflicting understandings and interpretations of the term. I believe that using a term like hybrid warfare with a very expansive definition risks misunderstanding threats, and often that will lead us to militarize the problem, therefore making the response to countering political, economic, informational, subversive, covert action, and other threats a uniform military responsibility when it might be better sourced through other agencies and departments. This, in my opinion, consumes scarce defense resources better spent preparing for more directly relatable military threats. Secondly, this also repeats, this is in my opinion, a mistake of the Cold War containment strategy by overly focusing on the military aspects of a conflict at the expense of political ones. While official statements and publications often cite the need for a, quote, whole of government or whole of society response to Russian, Chinese, or Iranian actions described as hybrid warfare, it becomes axiomatic that when something is called war, it is both consciously and unconsciously considered to be primarily a military problem that the rest of the national security system can delegate to secondary problem status because the Department of Defense has it. Now, I will confess that the term political warfare, a term I think encompasses many of the tactics that are considered hybrid warfare, also has the word war in it, although the adjective political may soften a little. That is why I believe the use of the term statecraft instead of hybrid warfare provides a clear perspective of these actions because it removes them from the realm of warfare and puts these actions into perspective of what they truly are: international relations between nations in conflict. I know that's a small nuance, but I believe it's kind of an important one. Anyway, I've gone on long enough, Frank. How would you respond to my objections to the term and its various interpretations?
Well, I agree with you about the misinterpretations, both strategically in the sense that you and I are in agreement that as it is now more commonly understood, it's a distraction and it's a somewhat dangerous expansion because it, particularly from a NATO-centric world, it tends to distract and develop capabilities that I don't think NATO needs and doesn't even fit the NATO charter. This is what Dr. Don Stoker, who's now at NDU, and Lucas Milewski in Europe at Leiden University have written about for the last 3 or 4 years, that this term has been misappropriated and used for something it wasn't intended. And they should be happier with a redefinition of political warfare, and there's been many arguments here in the United States from Dave Maxwell and Max Boot to go that way. I prefer something in the statecraft and subversion world, so I'm with you, and avoiding the over militarization of a problem that's not really military in character. Although in a lot of the Russian literature, it can be military in character, in the same way. But the other interpretation, if you use my interpretation of where the problems might be, things like ISIS, Syria, Donbass, and Hezbollah don't get handled. And that's the things that we were looking at Chechnya, looking at Russian histories and things that I was focusing on. And if you go too far in the other end and just you can get rid of the term and come up with a better term for the middle of the conflict spectrum. But those who are focusing on in Europe on what is statecraft, is not good enough to fight in a Donbass situation. It's not good enough to defeat ISIS. It's not good enough to deal with a very multimodal admixture in Syria, which almost defines definition. I'm not sure it's hybrid. I've never credited ISIS as getting quite to the degree of blend of conventional capabilities in an irregular force. In my monograph, I think I said it just came up a little bit short in my mind. But again, that was in 2005. I didn't write that in 11, 12, or 13, perhaps. But that's the difference between the two distinctions. So, and then kind of wrapping this up into the 21st century, where again is the focal point, for an expeditionary force like the Marine Corps for the United States, where do we see the greatest risk in the future? And a lot of people misreading the 2017 National Defense Strategy that I had a hand in with General Mattis and Bridge Kaupe and folks. We saw great power competition coming about, but I don't know if we necessarily agreed that large-scale conventional war was the be-all and end-all in great power competition. There's definitely something lower in the competition phase that would be covered by statecraft. But I've argued in both writings for FPRI and at War on the Rocks that maybe the middle of the conflict spectrum, where we thought hybridity was going to focus on, might be the greatest combination of both probability and consequence in the 21st century. I'm not sure that great powers with nukes like to bounce into each other. Tends to be escalatory, becomes very dangerous, gets a lot of attention from legislatures, gets a lot of attention around the world. And, one of the words that I avoided using in 2005, I never liked the word proxy forces because it only deals with the relationship between a client and one of the participants. It doesn't deal with the dyad that's actually in conflict. So I avoided using that. But I have a feeling that in the future, this is why in my 4 faces I've labeled the irregular circle as proxy, is I think that most of the competition and most of the conflict and most of the blood is going to be spilled again in the middle of the conflict spectrum in proxy warfare, because the great powers are going to be very hesitant to have direct conflict because of its escalatory potential. And so we may be coming full circle. I had a different reason for seeing non-state actors moving to the right with technology and becoming very, very lethal. And now I see a reason for great powers to avoid large-scale conventional operations. And again, I think that the greatest risk is not at the far right. That's the greatest consequence. It's not the greatest probability. That's at the low end in coercive statecraft. But the combination of likelihood versus consequence and the formula of risk would suggest that, again, the middle of the conflict spectrum might be where surrogates, hackers, mercenaries, the Wagner Group and variations, come about. And I see some evidence in China of China's use of surrogates, hackers, and private military companies that's starting to ape a little bit of the Russian practice. So there's an argument there, but I wouldn't label it hybrid because the word, as you said, accurately has been used by 10 different people in 10 different ways. And this happens with all forms of ideas. People pull out what they want, and And same thing with defense strategies, whether it's the revolution, military affairs, or transformation. Everybody tags everything into it, and it becomes meaningless. That's the academic world. I'm still amazed that so many practitioners stick with the original definition and embrace that originally. General Petraeus, in his recent book on conflict, has a page on General Madison, my work. Again, somebody who fought in multiple forms of conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan still sees today, apparently, some utility in that, both the verbiage and the general concept behind it.
I want to explore that a little deeper with relation to one specific great power who's mostly, when we think of hybrid warfare, we think about the Russian use of these different tools. In November of 2023, a British member of parliament and former British Army officer, Bob Seeley, wrote what I thought was an excellent piece in Foreign Affairs called The Russian Way of War, in which he describes how the Russian words "борьба," struggle, and "война," war, explain the thinking behind the Russian dual approach towards dealing with an enemy. Through "война," Russia seeks to win battles, but it's through "борьба," struggle, that they first weaken them. How applicable is this concept to your work, Frank?
I think I've read that article, and I do understand the vocabulary and the Russian usage, a lot of which I picked up in my college days at Penn under Professor Straussupe, the founder of FPRI and the originator of Orbis, who I was a student of Straussupe in the 70s, and I took his classes, two of them, and very much enjoyed them. And he implanted a conception of us about Russia's strategic schizophrenia. It's both a great power and it's vulnerable at the same time. And he laid out a concept that he called protracted conflict. And there was a lot of things that he imprinted in my brain about that class. You couldn't graduate from his course without being able to regurgitate his theory, but about Russia's interest in distortion, disinformation, distraction, pulsing in and out, using indirect approaches, rarely trying to go to conventional, using proxy forces as much as possible. And the blending of this kind of various forms of conflict, which I think would fit, the struggle, because it rarely got up to the W word in the way that the American mentality would get to it. And this is one of the things I picked up from reading Russian readings. It's also one of the critiques I picked up in the Chinese book, Unrestricted Warfare. It's got several pages that are just scathing critiques of the American military mindset. We have this conception that there's a universal notion of what war is, and it comes from Clausewitz, and state-centric, conventional, even though Clausewitz did write about the Spanish War, the Spanish ulcer. We just have a mentality that we think that everybody should be applying. We think it's been internationalized by norms or professionalism. And I think both the Chinese mentality and the Russian mentality have more of a more fluid, dynamic conception that includes both military and non-military, things. If you read all the Russian writings from, say 2011 up through Gerasimov's writings, you see this trend in their thinking too, where they're going back to some of their ideas about subversion and mixing non-military and military things in time and place that they didn't emphasize as much. And again, some of this is what readings one wants to pick up. If all you're going to read is Russian military, readings, rather than what they actually do or what they do under, Putin's era, led by an intelligence-centric clique, you'll get some different theories about practice versus theory in Russian writings and things. Putin and his crowd didn't go to the Russian General Staff College, and they didn't study their Clausewitz there. They had more experience in the Cold War and subversive statecraft and other forms of conflict, the struggle part. They don't see this Western concept. If you read my piece in Prism, I draw a continuum, and I never use the word peace. Just interviewed with a Bulgarian concept that they wanted to know where peace went, and I said, in my mind, it's always a struggle. And I think both the resistance mentality in Iran and some of the Chinese thinking about the resurrection of the Middle Kingdom and Russia's sense about struggle is we have a different conception about day-to-day statecraft and relationship between states than others. And we do make this distinction between peace and war, and we we underestimate and underinvest in unconventional and non-military instruments of national power. And so I share some of your concerns about where some of these trends take folks.
Well, Frank, thank you for your answer, but also for working in the name of our founder, Robert Straussupe, who was one of the great political scientists of his time. Unfortunately, I arrived at Penn just after you graduated, and I didn't have a chance to take one of his courses because he was serving as ambassador to Turkey at the time I was at Penn.
Yeah, second time. Yeah.
Yeah, a great intellect. And again, the founder of Foreign Policy Research Institute and of Orbis magazine. Now, let me ask you kind of a closing here, and a very general question. Take it wherever it may go. But whether we call the many and diverse challenges to security of the United States and its citizens hybrid warfare, or an example of international relations between states in conflict, Frank, how do you see what threatens the United States today? And what should we do to posture to deal with it, especially those threats that are less than conventional? We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, most of my most recent work of late has been in the informational domain, where I think we even have more of a problem with vocabulary, terminology, division of labor. I think both as an internal threat and as an external threat, we have little understanding of how our adversaries are exploiting our openings, our institutional seams, and striking at our belief systems, our understanding of each other, our communications with each other. I'm not convinced that cognitive warfare is just not another label that over militarizes a problem, but there is something in the malign influence world, and I'm concerned that we don't understand it very well. We don't appreciate it because we overweight hardware in the military sense, as opposed to software and what people believe, what they think, what they vote for, what they're willing to support or not support. I think there's some greater need for understanding of that, and I'm a little bit concerned that, from what I understand, I know we've shut down the Global Engagement Center. I know the FBI has shut down a foreign information manipulation center. I don't know what we've done at the NIC with some of the synthesis capabilities that we had put together there that I've been pushing for a number of years, so that we would understand foreign influence and be able to discern the campaigns and be able to react in some way. But hopefully, I'm sure up at Langley, there's still some capabilities and special activities that's hopefully devoted to the information dimension of statecraft and its abuse and interference by foreign entities. But I think that might be particularly in the unconventional or non-military world, I think that's the greatest challenge.
Well, Frank, thank you. This has been an exceptional podcast with you today. Thank you so much for your time. And I'd just like to know, what should our audience be aware of that you've recently published or about to publish if they want to learn more about this?
I've written a paper for the Army War College on America's next defense strategy, and I think I've got some clear priorities and investments and some missions, and I've included both a conventional mission as a high priority in Asia, but I think I put in a plug for unconventional capabilities and investment as well, and also investments in space and strategic deterrence, which are very undervalued. So the Army War College, the summer issue of Parameters, there's an article there titled Next NDS, Next Defense Strategy, that I commend everybody's attention to.
Thank you. And for everyone who's been listening, thank you for listening to Overheard. To get different perspectives on intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. We hope you'll continue to listen in and recommend us to your friends. If you enjoy these podcasts, please visit the Foreign Policy Research Institute website at fpri.org to subscribe to our mailing list to receive updates on future podcasts and other FPRI events. Please also consider joining FPRI and donating to it to support our efforts to provide the public and policymakers with fact-driven, nonpartisan analysis about the most pressing foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States. We look forward to you joining us again next month for a new Overheard podcast. Goodbye.